US nuclear policy for more than 50 years is non-proliferation. Like, they don't want additional states to get nuclear weapons, and they inter alia try to prevent that by extending nuclear protection to allies. The whole nuclear sharing arrangement in Europe was in the beginning was of course also aimed at, for example, making the Germans not build the bomb, right? Because we said, well, we want to keep our allies safe, but we also don't want them to have nuclear ambitions. So once Ukraine, just drops this nuclear topic, they of course strengthen their case for strong security guarantees. So I think it's a rhetorical strategy, not so much a strategy really founded in facts and we'll see Ukraine building a bomb. I think that's a Russian narrative that we also should not support. But it is an interesting political phenomenon, and I think it will influence all discussions about potential guarantees. And the guarantors, of course, Ukraine ideally wants the NATO membership with Article 5, really ironclad, nuclear commitment, basically. But the question is, will they ever get that? And then, how do you construct a security guarantee? Maybe without that nuclear component.
Hello, everyone. This is Paweł Kusiak and Łukasz Wyszyński. We would like to welcome you in Polish Naval Academy YouTube channel entitled International Relations. Today, we will talk, on the one hand, about place of nuclear weapon in contemporary international relations, and based on this, on the other hand, about influence of nuclear weapon about Russian nuclear threats, Russian nuclear saber-rattling after a Russian war on Ukraine since February 2022, or even since Crimea annexion. I would like to welcome our great guest, Franziska Stärk, researcher in the Arms Control and Emerging Technologies Program, Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg. Franziska, it's great to have you here.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. Good to be here.
Dear Franziska, Paweł, all of our audience, I think that the first question Paweł already gave us. I think that the role of nuclear weapon during the Cold War is quite clear for everyone here. But my first question to you is, what's your point of view about the current role of the nuclear weapon in an international relation, in policy of the states which got this kind of, tool of foreign policy? What's your point of view on this topic?
I mean, I don't think that the role has fundamentally changed in the sense of that it is now completely different compared to the Cold War. I think if we look at the history, we do see that these weapons seem to help certain states that have them deter nuclear attack against them, maybe also major conventional attacks, so meaning attacks against the capital of your state, against the functioning of your state, really major attack. However, at the same time, I think we see that beyond that, the influence is sometimes also limited. And I think there we already noticed that during the Cold War, right? The historic examples that always get talked about is, Soviet Union going into Afghanistan, United States going into Vietnam, and their big nuclear arsenals did not really help them, right? So the question really, I think, until today remains, can you employ these tools of international relations, as you said them, for something else that is not, I would say, this basic existential defensive purpose? And now the interesting thing, of course, is that we see a major actor, namely Russia, trying to employ nuclear weapons for offensive purposes. So basically, committing an aggressive act, attacking a non-nuclear state, Ukraine, and shielding this aggression with nuclear threats. So this is interesting in the sense of that he tries to stretch the purpose of nuclear weapons. And this, of course, gives us like new theoretical puzzles, but of course it is like a very major unsettling fact, and it gives us pause because of course we're like, well, I mean, this seems to be a tool that can kind of like cause not just, as some people always say, stability between great powers, but it can actually be a tool that can be used for, well, adventurous activities that we're probably not really happy about, right? So when people say, you know, like nuclear deterrence is this great tool of peacemaking, you know, like the whole theory of nuclear peace, that of course has some caveats, so to say.
Yes, because maybe this is not, maybe this is only our point of view, typical for our place on the map. But after collapse Soviet Union, I think we stop thinking about possibility of using nuclear weapon as a political tool, as a political leverage to achieve something. Russia did it. We need to remember first time during Crimea annexion, they also start to threat. They start using nuclear threats as a strategic communication tool to stop other powers, interfere of other powers to this issue. But I think, and my question is, do you agree with that? That after invasion to Ukraine, Russia starting develop new way of using this kind of bomb, this kind of tool. What I mean, for example, a lot of influential political thinkers from Russia claim that maybe the time the time when the proliferation is not good for us as a superpower is stopped. Maybe we need to start to share this technology with our allies, for example, Iran, and maybe we need to use non-strategic nuclear weapon, tactical nuclear weapon. Obviously, I think we agree that all kinds of using nuclear weapon have a strategic meaning, but in this. So what do you think? What do you think about how do you put this to the theory which we developed after Second World War?
I mean, that the current events are, in a sense, making a case for nuclear weapons possession, which we don't want, right? And of course, a lot of states see that and say, well, I mean, that's interesting. Look what you can do with these. Apparently, you can act on an international state with, like, on an international state with near impunity. And that's, of course, something that other actors might also be interested in, right? So it is kind of like changing or upping the appeal, so to say. And that is, of course, worrying because it undermines the basic principle and functioning of our non-proliferation architecture. And the basic agreement we had there was, of course, with enshrined in the non-proliferation treaty since the 70s, basically, where we say, well, I mean, a few nuclear weapon states exist, they have nuclear weapons, but they promise to disarm them in the long term. And while they have it, nobody else can have them. And the thing is, of course, now, if we see nuclear weapon states not only not fulfilling their disarmament promise to the rest of the world, but also using nuclear weapons in an aggressive sense or, like arming even more, that, of course, creates tension with the rest of the world, which, of course, is also very much aware that, of course, now, like Russia is a very prominent example, but of course, we've seen nuclear threats also by other nuclear powers before, probably not in that extent, right? But it happened before. And there's, of course, also the whole legacy of nuclear weapons attached to this. And states have not forgotten about that. Nuclear weapons didn't just, come into existence. There's the whole testing legacy attached to that. And of course, the states that have kind of seen that and have seen how, for example, nuclear weapon states also tested their nuclear weapons in countries like former colonies, for example, or in places they seemed less worthy. So often, like harming local communities, indigenous communities. And, like until today, none of the nuclear weapon states issued an apology for these testing that they did. And just to put out a number there, I think since the first Trinity test and until 1988, when the norm against testing began to solidify, we had a nuclear explosion every 9.6 days. So just to give you like the magnitude of what was happening there. So the Cold War, from the perspective of many states, I think was not actually that cold as it seemed, because these explosions took place. We had the proxy wars taking place. So now that's kind of like the costs of nuclear deterrence are hitting a country in the northern hemisphere, Ukraine, right? And it's in the center of Europe. So in Europe, we are now very alarmed about the consequences of nuclear weapons and the consequences of nuclear deterrence. We're like, okay, apparently we do have a problem here. Other states have been aware before, right? So there is, of course, this kind of like north-south divide, so to say. And not everyone is kind of like shocked and surprised like other parts of the world, I would argue. But that is, of course, it doesn't make things right in any way. It's just like one aspect that sometimes gets forgotten a bit.
And based on your thoughts that you said about the current situation in Europe and our thinking about the threats from Russia and they using the nuclear weapon as a kind of the cover of the policy on Ukraine, how we could react as a West and I think as a Europe, because United States, okay, they've got really huge nuclear potential, but in Europe we've got discussion, we've got some programs like NATO nuclear sharing, we've got Great Britain, we've got France, but the question is how we as a Europe could react on these Russian threats. Of course, if we've got on the back some things that maybe Russia don't really want to use this weapon. Maybe it's only some kind of the sign that the Russia in a military way is now really weak, and the only way is to say that we are able to use new nuclear weapon against, I don't know, Ukraine, Poland, Germany, and Western countries. What's your opinion and how we could react as a Europe?
Well, now you're posing a difficult question because as a researcher, you never want to give policy advice, right? No, I think there are like two extremes of the debate, right? There are those who say, well, we must not pay attention to these threats whatsoever. They're inflated, they're excessive, they're basically a bluff, right? And I think to a certain extent, we have seen also Russia bluffing a little bit because, like the arms deliveries did happen despite the threats and they're getting more intensive day by day. Or I mean, like at least like we can see a progression from 2022 where, for example, Germany said, oh, we will just send helmets. And now like we send actual like major military weapons, right? So I think to a certain extent, these threats have been proven as a bluff, right? Because the red lines that have been like alluded to have not always been then held. And so I understand the argument, but at the same time, I think it's also not wise to say, well, this has no basis whatsoever. We must not care about that because you don't want to gamble with that, right? When it comes to nuclear use. So I think like a solid middle ground there is needed. And when it comes to the reaction, I think there are two levels. There's the question of what do we do with these concrete threats, right? What do we do with an actor that repeatedly employs nuclear threats? And I think Russia has seen the effectiveness of that. Like first, like when the full-scale invasion started, they have seen how unsettled the rest of the world was. And then in fall 2022, we now know that even like the US intelligence community was highly alerted for the risk of, Russia actually using them. So they saw that we take them seriously. So the question is, like, how do we deal with that? And there is, I think one approach is to basically say, and this is what I think the West has done to a certain extent, is to form a coalition of Western states, but also non-Western states, and just say principally, like on a basic level, nuclear threats are inadmissible. Like, we shouldn't do that, right? So this is the G20 declaration language that we've seen, I think, last year, where even states like France that normally, like, will never say that like nuclear threats are inadmissible, because I mean, they themselves rely on nuclear deterrence. So this is I was surprised that they actually came out with that. But it is interesting because it shows you these kind of like norms-based approaches that say we must up the international norm of the nuclear taboo, we must up the norm that these weapons must never be used, and that will be even more effective if we get states to say that Russia cares about. So if Germany says, we don't want you to use nuclear weapons threats, okay, right? But if China says that, I think that's a different story. So I think that is one approach you can make, right? And then there's the whole question of, okay, how do we deal with an actor that exposes this type of behavior in the long term, in the strategic sense? So how do we respond when we, like, look at the future European security architecture? And I think here the opinions range wide. Like, personally, I'm not in favor of a major European nuclear armament. I think we have to do more on the conventional side of things. I think it's more effective, actually, because you basically say, well, I mean, you can make all your nuclear threats, but we'll make sure that we have a solid conventional defense also on the eastern side, so that if you tempt us, we can kind of like credibly say that we'll respond to that. But of course, I think there are a lot of other experts also arguing, okay, we must do something on the nuclear front. And I think these voices will grow stronger now that Trump is elected, and now that Europe is like even more fearing that their nuclear guarantee that they have been under thus far may not be as strong, or may fail even in the future.
You describe as possible strategies, and we see that it happened that after first Putin's threats, German Chancellor Scholz go to China and had common statement with Xi Jinping about not acceptable of using nuclear weapon. Obviously, we can explain this that China not have so strong nuclear possibilities like Russia and USA, but it's another topic. But okay, we know what we can do, but what strategy we can use. But what happen if, I know this is some kind of political science fiction scenario, but we hear that the moment when Russia really analyze possibility of use or have some nuclear manifestation was on the May, maybe June 2022, when the Ukrainian counter-offensive started. My private opinion is that's right. I think it was only moment when the Russian elites, Russian government have face on they standing in front of the collapse, and the regime inside of the state can collapse, and this is why they can analyze using of nuclear weapon. But what Western states, NATO, Europe states can do if Russia, what happen, maybe not what can happen in the world about nuclear taboo if Russia decide to use nuclear weapon, not in little, on even little nuclear manifestation. What do you think? Do you think we can answer? Maybe we can't answer for this question now, because this unpredictable situation, because we never faced in this kind of situation. We obviously in 1945 United States used 2 times nuclear weapon, but it was only nuclear states, and it wasn't. It was other theoretical and world situation. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, like it's a little bit like like looking in a fortune glass, like in a crystal glass bowl. So I think, I mean, again, there are those who say, well, we should not, like respond. We should again push the international norm of the taboo and like have international condemnation, and that will like isolate Russia, and it will show them like they've crossed the line, and this will even strengthen the norm because you have refrained from like responding. Then there's those who say, well, we can like conventionally respond. And there are like also different degrees to that. So I think like we've all like read the reports, like the United States is, like doing war gaming basically from day one of this invasion, and like trying different scenarios. And I mean, some people, like say, oh, well, let's just sink their boats in the sea, right? And like once their fleet is gone, like that will send a sufficient response. Others saying, oh, we must like equally also use a nuclear weapon. Personally, I think the problem in all these scenarios is, of course, what happens next. Because there's the idea in deterrence theory that once you have like replicated, or like to a like lower extent conventionally, but like a significant hit, you have re-established deterrence. The question is if that works, because that is, of course, decided again in the mind of your adversary, right? And the question is, do we all go home after that? Or what happens after we have retaliated, right? So that is kind of like the question we must ask. So, I mean, honestly, like the major thing that I would try is that it doesn't happen in the first place. So we must, by all means, avoid Russia actually taking that step. And I think to manipulate that decision, there are different ways to do that. So again, those that say we must like act in strength, right? So we must kind of like up our own deterrence efforts and show that we are resolved. Well, you can also like, again, try to push this like internationally, and like, for example, in the P5 context, try to kind of like lower the tensions. So do kind of like classical risk reduction work where you try to like have transparency between the nuclear weapon states, where you try to at least keep, like crisis communication open, where you try to address risks on maybe like not like the classical strategic nuclear weapons risk, but discuss other risks, and thereby then hope to proceed to discuss again like the really like sensitive areas. So I think a lot of these like classical risk reduction measurements that the like arms control community has been pretty much doing since the like 1970s, 1980s, but like adapted to the current context. And of course, the context is not favorable. So it's really hard work. Not a lot is going on. So even like in the P5 context, it will be hard to do that. What I find hope in is that at least we see like some reports that say that the communication lines between Russia and the US are still working, so kind of like the red telephone still exists. That's good. But of course, like the whole tradition of, separating the issue of nuclear weapons from other political tensions and saying, well, we will talk strategic arms control, we will talk nuclear risks, we will make sure that this realm of politics is kind of like a little bit like compartmentalized from the rest, right? And we'll keep that one safe, despite all our political disagreements. That no longer works with a regime that explicitly links and manipulates nuclear risk to get their will, right? So you have an actor that explicitly tries to be ambivalent, that does not want to be transparent, that does want like chaos to reign. So this is, of course, an actor with which all these type of like classical risk reduction endeavors are extremely hard to implement.
Okay, but I'm wondering why Russia Federation decided on use these nuclear threats against West, and if we back on a period of time before war on Ukraine, we saw that Vladimir Putin many times said that from Russian perspective, the balance of power not against Poland, Germany, but against United States isn't right, because United States started creating anti-ballistic missile systems. A few days ago in Poland, the new US base launched near Słupsk in Redzikowo. And this is, I think, strong argument in Vladimir Putin narration that the Russia is a little bit afraid of not Western nuclear threats, but the process of building the anti-ballistic missile system, mostly in the United States. Of course, Europe also tried to take a part in this process. What do you think about it? Maybe the reason is that the Russia is afraid of situation that they don't have the balance of power. I mean, of course, in the strategic level with United States, and it means that only in a world we've got two powers, United States maybe, and in China, and the Russia Federation will become weaker and weaker.
Yeah, I mean, like, this is a classical narrative. I mean, I've been like involved in some sort of like, you know, like track 2 type of diplomacy things, and this is always what you hear, right? Like 2003, the US left the anti-ballistic missile treaty, and this is where things started to unravel. And honestly, I think it was a bad move for the US to do that. It was stupid, because it raised all these fears of, well, if they get, not maybe now, but probably like in 10 years, in 20 years times, if their ballistic missile defense gets so sophisticated, they might be able to undermine our capability to strike them. And they might have, combined with their global prompt strike, oh God, I think I just mixed that name up, but like their conventional strike capabilities, combined with that, they might be able to achieve some sort of like first strike advantage, right? So this is like one of the like key fears that Russian actors have always had. And I think there are like 2 mistakes that have been probably made. Like, first one being like, we always kind of like, the West always said, oh wait, I mean, like these missile defense systems that we're deploying there, like Aegis Ashore and all that, it's for the Iranian missile threats only, right? We do not aim these at you. And of course, you know, you can say that a lot of times, but, you know, like if you're sitting in Moscow, basically you're like, should I believe this? I don't know. And I think there have been opportunities missed to kind of like, to do some sort of like transparency measurements, and to show them like, look, because there's also the whole thing of, okay, you could also use them for offensive launchers type of argument, right? So like to actually like have transparency and like let Russian inspectors see these, you know, like systems, and show them, like really try to reassure these are not aimed at you, but were they? So this is like really like a question. But then, you know, this whole blame game, I'm a bit like, you know, like Russia was the actor in the last 10 to 15 years that really unraveled the nuclear arms control architecture, not the West. Of course, you know, like mistakes have been made, but really like the major flaws are clearly, you know, like done by Russia. So these old grievances, of course, still play a role. And I think they'll play a bigger role probably even in the future, because if you look, for example, in the Trump Project 2025 agenda, and what they plan for missile defense, it's likely that they will revise this policy of saying, oh, it's just, you know, like against Iran, and actually explicitly also say this is aimed at Russia and China, and we are trying to really reinforce our, you know, like ballistic missile shield, and actually trying to get strategic advantages out of that. And you know, I'm just saying, like, it doesn't help strategic stability if you do that. So I think, you know, like, I'm not saying that like the fears are right, and that I'm highly skeptical that ballistic missile defense can achieve much when it really comes to these like strategic nuclear exchanges. Like, I'm not a fan. Like, I don't really believe in it. But of course, the fear is there, and I think it might get even worse because we have different actors that will like really dominate NATO in the future there.
Okay. Switch to other topic. On October this year, Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukrainian president, said that if Ukraine not get chance to join to NATO, not get hope to quickly join to NATO, Ukraine needs to start preparing to get their own nuclear weapon. Obviously, we need to know that we need to read this statement in the historical and political context. It was before US election. that Ukraine is in a complicated situation. But we also need to remember that Ukraine, after Soviet Union collapse, had nuclear weapon. Okay, we know that it was not so simple that this nuclear weapon was a part of the Soviet nuclear system. So we are not sure that Ukraine can use this weapon in success. And building nuclear weapons is not so simple. This is old technology from 60s, but even if you get nuclear weapon, you need to get capabilities to use it, and it is the other problem. But what is the point? He said that if we not get guarantee, we need to start thinking and get nuclear weapon, because this is only it'll be only real guarantee. And do you agree that the nuclear weapon can be? You're talking about that, but I want to hear your answer in this context. Do you think that nuclear weapon can be only real guarantee now of security for this kind of state like Ukraine? And second, do you think that this kind of what do other superpowers, if Ukraine real want to get nuclear weapon? Remember, obviously, we need to remember about context that this is a not maybe failed state, but close to be failed. A lot of problems, catastrophic demographic situation, economy. But remember about all of that.
All right, there's a lot to unpack here, I think. Thanks for that. So I think there are several aspects here. So first, there's the whole, I think, historic grievance of Ukraine. Like, we have contributed to the non-proliferation regime by abandoning this inherited Soviet legacy arsenal that we got. Like, they got, I think, approximately 4,400 nuclear weapons that were on their territory, and they decided to send them back to Russia, enter the non-proliferation regime. And then we had the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, basically saying, like, Western countries will guarantee their security, Russia will guarantee their security, and thus they can enter the non-proliferation treaty and give up this arsenal. However, as you said, they never had full custody over that arsenal, and it would have been financially, technically, and politically, I think, very, very hard, probably even unfeasible to actually maintain that, given the political pressure they would have faced otherwise. But of course, there is this historic grievance that they got these guarantees and now they are being invaded by a depository state of the NPT, right? So that is, of course, the context in which we're talking. And in the context in which I think Zelensky made these remarks, which were in the context of this Budapest Memorandum, where he said, well, we've seen it once, like, it didn't really work out for us. Like, now we want ironclad guarantees, so we need NATO membership. And he walked quickly, afterwards, both the Ukrainian Foreign Office, but also he himself, walked back his comments about nuclear weapons, basically saying, no, I didn't mean that, we don't do nuclear weapons, but NATO membership is the only thing that will basically save us. And of course, the implicit thing that he says here is, we need a nuclear guarantee in the future, and we want one, and we won't be okay with anything else, right? And that is interesting, because even personally, I think for technical reasons, for political reasons, it's extreme costs if nuclearization would actually take place in Ukraine. They would need years for that. The political pressure would be immense. Also, I don't think that Russia will sit by and be like, oh yeah, please go ahead and build your nuclear weapon, right? So to build a nuclear weapon arsenal during wartime is an endeavor. I don't know, it just seems very unrealistic to me. But what the interesting aspect here is, of course, that you're shifting the discourse. You're dropping the possibility of, well, we will need this nuclear guarantee. Or we could, now they, of course, say, we're under IAEA safeguards, we're in the NPT, we do not want to change that. But of course, in the future, if they, from time to time, drop the possibility of that changing, that unsettles the West enormously, because basically the US nuclear policy for more than 50 years is non-proliferation. They don't want additional states to get nuclear weapons, and they inter alia, try to prevent that by extending nuclear protection to allies. The whole nuclear sharing arrangement in Europe was in the beginning was of course also aimed at, for example, making the Germans not build the bomb, right? Because we said, well, we want to keep our allies safe, but we also don't want them to have nuclear ambitions. So once Ukraine, just drops this nuclear topic, they of course strengthen their case for strong security guarantees. So I think it's a rhetorical strategy, not so much a strategy really founded in facts and we'll see Ukraine building a bomb. I think that's a Russian narrative that we also should not support. But it is an interesting political phenomenon, and I think it will influence all discussions about potential guarantees. And the guarantors, of course, Ukraine ideally wants the NATO membership with Article 5, really ironclad, nuclear commitment, basically. But the question is, will they ever get that? And then, how do you construct a security guarantee? Maybe without that nuclear component. So that would probably involve really stationing major conventional systems, support, training, everything in a however shaped Ukraine, in a however shaped post-war country. And that will be a difficult discussion. And honestly, I don't want to get eaten alive in the comment section, so I won't propose how that's looked like. But of course, the background noise here is nuclear.
I completely agree with you, and I think this is also the open question from other countries like South Korea, Japan, and US guarantee for those countries, I don't know, against Chinese policy. But I would like to back to your answer in the previous question. You mentioned about future presidency of Donald Trump, and I'm curious about your opinion. What do you think? How he played this role against Russia Federation, against China? Because of course we all knew that from United States, China is the biggest challenge in the future. How Donald Trump might use the subject of nuclear power in U.S. policy against Russia Federation? Maybe he wants to build some new agreement of using and developing nuclear weapon. What do you think?
So I think again, it's worthwhile to actually take a look at this, Project 2025 agenda and actually read the sections on the DoD and Department of State. And there you can get some hints. And of course, we will see a more hawkish nuclear policy overall. And what really dominates, I think, the future Trump administration nuclear thinking is really this whole thing of the three-body problem. So the problem that you have to deter China while at the same time also deterring Russia. And this is what they call the three-body problem. And I think it is really the lens through which they see nuclear weapons in general. And I think this has several implications. First of all, of course, the question of, what do we do with New STARTs when it expires? So that's the treaty that limits the strategic arsenals of the United States and Russia. And, I think in February 2026, that one expires. Now, of course, some Democrats still hope that some sort of, follow-on agreement, maybe not a treaty, but an informal type of agreement between Russia and the United States will prevail, that they say, okay, we'll stick to certain ceiling numbers type of thing. But then, my hopes are fairly limited that we'll see that with a Trump administration that wants to actually increase the nuclear arsenal to be able to deter China and Russia at the same time. I'm not saying that this makes any sense, but I think it's rather likely. And then there's also, I think, the issue that unsettles me the most when I read that program was that they basically say, well, let's keep the testing capability at high readiness. So the whole question of resuming nuclear testing is pretty big, I think, in their minds. And that is, of course, something that could cause a chain reaction, because let's say either Russia or the United States, if the conflict gets even more tense, decides to test again, of course the other state will also test, and that will mean other nuclear weapon states might also start again to test, and then we have the whole basically we have the 70s and 80s all over again, and then that's a very, very unsettling scenario that I hope that won't happen. But these are two major things that I see coming for their policy overall. And then there's of course the question, and you mentioned that Europe, what will they do basically? Because overall, be it Trump or not Trump, but the US is reorientating towards Asia. So the question is, who will guarantee the European security? And I think Trump doesn't even have to leave NATO to really install this fear of, I potentially will abandon you if you face trouble. And I mean, he's made pretty explicit comments about that previously. So already people are quite unsettled. So I think the whole question and the whole discussion about Euro deterrence, again, I'm not a big fan, to be honest, but I think the question will be there. And I think personally that we'll see a lot of talks between France, Germany, UK, Poland, basically about how to face that and what to do about it. And the interesting thing is, of course, that the United States, they have this strategy where they have both strategic and non-strategic nuclear weapons. And currently the nuclear sharing arrangement is one where we use these non-strategic, some call them tactical nuclear weapons, in case whatever, in case it comes push comes to shove, basically, right? And then if we look at the European nuclear powers, France and UK, they do not rely on war-fighting nuclear strategies. So neither France nor the UK actually have these non-strategic type of weapons. And that is, of course, a question that raises issues about how do we then guarantee the defense in the East, and the question of, will the East ever trust France and the UK to guarantee the security as the United States did? So these are a whole bunch of new questions, basically, or not so new, but now probably more urgent questions coming up with the Trump victory.
Okay, last question from my side. I think last year in 2023, on Taylor and Francis Strategic Studies journal was published article of Jacques Himas. I hope this is correct pronunciation. Not scared. I don't want to ask you about this article, but long story short, because we talk because we agreed that nuclear weapon changed the world, I think, but he developed thesis that his psychologist and international relations expert about proliferation, he claimed that probably governments never want to resign of nuclear weapon because it happens something he called the bomb like a god. He used political metaphor, bomb as a god, some kind of political sacralization of this kind of political tool. He largely explained that. So if somebody is interested in, please try to find this article on Taylor and Francis. But my question to you, I'm a specialist about political science fiction question, that do you believe on someday during our life, maybe later, humanity resigned, states, superpowers resigned of nuclear weapon, and what needs to happen to achieve this?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question. I mean, personally, I don't think it's unfeasible, but of course the world would have to change, because sometimes I think we misunderstand disarmament as being, the current world minus nuclear weapons. But I don't think that this would be the case if we ever were in that situation where we can actually dismantle the nuclear weapons arsenals. I think the world would fundamentally be different from the one today. So we would have seen a lot of political rapprochement. We would have seen probably, as you mentioned, nuclear weapons being differently, because right now they are perceived as these massive tools of power, and it's this as you said, almost like godlike status yielding instruments. So let's say, let's do some, utopic thinking here. Like, let's say in 100 years, we do have different views about security, and we center human security in the discourse, and nuclear weapons are brandished as useless tools because, I don't know, like cyber capabilities made it possible to track submarines. So actually, like, nuclear deterrence is not as useful as it used to be. And people are like, well, actually, these are things, relics of the past. So a little bit like the thinking past 1990. And then if, step by step, we see like a delegitimization of nuclear deterrence, I could see, if we are in a much more peaceful world, how they could be abandoned. I don't think that you can really like put the genie back in the bottle completely, because of course you can't kill all the physicists. You can't kill the knowledge how to build nuclear weapons, right? And we don't want to kill all the physicists. Like, we can't do that, right? So of course the knowledge remains. And there's a very interesting concept which is called virtual deterrence, basically. So this idea that then in this case where you no longer have nuclear weapons, the knowledge how to build them, so the knowledge that the bomb can basically come back, deters the other party from rebuilding the arsenal. However, this is a lot of theory, and it might be very, very far away in a sense. But I do think it's important to like not think, like to keep like your mind basically open to these type of scenarios and to really think long term. Because if we only ever think about the next 10 years, of course we kind of like stick to our current perception of nuclear weapons. But as I said, climate change, developments in cyber, like other existential risks could fundamentally like change how international relations work in, let's say, 20 years, 30 years. So there is kind of like in the future, I think, possibility that there are changes that we probably can't even foresee right now, and that could make nuclear weapons rather a liability than a security guarantor, right? So, and one last point here, I think also ethically, if you really think in the long term, and if we say like 100 years, and let's say like the probability of nuclear war is 1% annually, right? And of course that's like very low, but if you like think about that for 100 years, that gives you like a 2 in 3 chance of nuclear war actually happening within that 100 years. So if you do the math, and if you do not actually like reduce this risk that we have on a constant basis, at some point, like your luck will run out. So if you really like think in the long term, personally, I'm like, well, like we have to keep the hope that we at some point get rid of these weapons, simply because otherwise, like they will probably get rid of us. So but yeah, that I don't want to like appear as the person who says that this is easily done, or that like, like we can just like get nuclear weapons away like right now, and like that this would like work. Right? We would have to see a fundamentally different world for this to really work out.
Okay, and I promise the last question from my side and the last question in our discussion, because your thoughts are really interesting for me, because I also agree that the things that might stop nuclear weapon as a tool of international relation might be the bigger threats. Yes, you claim about the climate change, about, I don't know, economical and social challenges. But I'm wondering, maybe it means not only a new kind of a weapon like cyber weapon, but maybe scientists in the future create stronger and more destructive weapon. Of course, I hope that will never happen. And back to my question, it is possible that if some country, I don't know, Pakistan, India, Russia Federation, United States, use only one atomic bomb, maybe it will be the factor that international society say, okay, it is enough. We don't want to live in this shape of the world anymore, and we start to discuss. And the question is, maybe this kind of the discussion should be started in the United Nations, I don't know, in NATO, in BRICS. Do you think that the current international order is able to start real discussion about the world without nuclear weapon?
Oh, I wish it was, but I'm afraid that in the current, at least the current fora where nuclear issues are discussed are more or less all stuck, right? We have the NPT where we don't have like a concluding document since I think 2 or 3 review conferences. So like Russia blocking consensus last conference. So this forum is more or less stuck, and we don't really see the nuclear weapon states engaging in serious consideration of like actual disarmament measures or even like risk reduction measurements. We have the conference of disarmament that is stuck, I think, since I don't know, like decades. We have basically also like the classical bilateral arms control talks between US and Russia completely stuck. I think the P5 forum might be like one of the last remaining forums where like discussions are still continuing, but these are like really, like I said, risk reduction and like really like basic understanding type of, not like revolutionary type of talk there. So I mean, we initially, when nuclear weapons came into being, of course, we tried the United Nations to fix this, right? And the whole Morgenthau plan and all of that, like, right? So we had like this idea that multilaterally we have to rein in this threat. Maybe, I mean, in the future, you yourself listed the threats that are facing us will basically like force us to cooperate and find a solution, simply because it at some point might become a question of resources, not so much financial resources, but political resources. So can we still afford certain, like security architecture while other threats are becoming increasingly important? And then, of course, like it would have to be some sort of, like international forum. There's, of course, the ban treaty that, like tries to really like take the normative approach and like trying to like raise the norms against nuclear weapons by prohibiting it. But then, like we have none of the nuclear weapon states engaging with that treaty whatsoever. So, of course, you need to have the nuclear weapon states on board. So whatever forum it will be, it will have to probably engage both, like multilateral mechanisms, non-nuclear weapon states, like really pressure campaigns type of things, plus like really like the hard security nuclear weapons forum. Yeah, but like I said, like if I knew how to do that, I would tell you.
We will wait for that. It's not simple to recapitulation our discussion, to summarize, because we touch a lot of topics, a lot of very important things. Nuclear weapon is connect with a lot of emotion, because it's simple to use idea of nuclear weapon in some kind of popular newspapers, using as a disinformation tool to threat people and to use as a, and Russia do this. We need to try to understand. This is only chance, only knowledge. Knowledge is our superpower, I think, and we need to try better understand how this process works. And Franziska, thank you for your contribution to this process. Thank you to this discussion. Please subscribe our channel. Write a commentary if you have share with us with your idea. What do you think? And now I want to invite you for our next conversation. Our today guest was Franziska Stärk from Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg. Franziska, one more time, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.